Hello. I hope you're doing good. Hey, today, Grandma wants to read you a history story. And this is about the Revolutionary War. I thought it was appropriate. Seems how we're in the month of July and we just finished celebrating Independence Day. So this is called the Revolutionary War. And it starts out in the 1600s and 1700s. Thousands of people from Europe came to North America. By 1732, 13 British colonies stretched along North America's eastern coast. They were the 13 colonies. The colonists followed customs and obeyed laws from Europe. In 1763, the British government needed money to pay its army. So the Parliament, which was a group of leaders that governed England, decided to raise the money by taxing the colonists. In 1765, Parliament passed something called the Stamp Act. This law said that all printed paper would cost extra money. The new tax law angered the people in the colonies. The colonists thought it was unfair because they were not allowed to vote on any decisions made by Parliament. The colonists were afraid they might lose their freedom. Colonial leaders sent letters to King George and Parliament asking them to remove the hated tax. Parliament ended the Stamp Act in 1766. And the colonists rejoiced. They were so happy they weren't being taxed for all their printed paper. But the next year, Parliament passed new taxes on glass and lead, paper, paint, and tea. Again, the colonists protested bitterly. Tax collectors were attacked by angry mobs. Another popular means of protest was the boycott. In a boycott, people refused to buy certain goods. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams led boycotts against British goods. The British were shocked. After all, the British had protected the colonies from the hostile French colonists and from the American Indian warriors. The British king and Parliament thought the Americans were acting like ungrateful, spoiled children. They thought they should be able to tax them and people in America shouldn't protest. Boston became the center of the colonial rebellion. In 1768, Parliament sent ships filled with British soldiers to the city. Parliament and King George thought the army could make the colonists obey their laws. The army only made things worse. The colonists saw the soldiers as proof that Britain intended to destroy their freedom. In the Massachusetts countryside, Grandma can't pronounce the name of that state, farmers picked up their muskets and trained themselves to be soldiers. They called themselves Minutemen. If the British army marched, the Minutemen could be ready at a minute's notice. The people of Boston hated having soldiers in their city. In 1770, an angry mob of colonists threw stones and snowballs at British soldiers. I don't think stones and snowballs would do a lot of good. But the soldiers panicked and fired into the crowd. 5 men were killed and 6 were wounded. Colonists called it the Boston Massacre. The British ended the taxes except the one on tea. Still, the colonists were not happy. In December 1773, a group of colonists dressed themselves to look like American Indians. They rowed out to 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped all the tea that was on board into the water. Parliament and the king were furious when they heard about the so-called Boston Tea Party. They closed Boston Harbor in 1774. Outside Boston, the colonists grew angrier and began collecting guns and gunpowder. In September, a group of colonial leaders called the First Continental Congress. They met in Philadelphia. They wrote angry letters to the king and to Parliament. General Thomas Gage, the British governor of the Massachusetts colony, learned that gunpowder was being stored in a town called Concord. In 1775, on April 18th, he ordered a force of 700 men to seize the gunpowder. An American named Paul Revere heard of the plan. He rode in the night, alerting everyone in the countryside. "The British are coming," he yelled. Farmers stumbled from their beds and grabbed their muskets. On Lexington Green, about 70 Minutemen waited as the dawn lighted around them. The British would have to pass through Lexington to get to Concord. The American commander, Captain John Parker, warned his men, "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." A British commander galloped up and angrily ordered the colonists to leave. Behind him, the British soldiers marched into view. Parker realized that he could not defeat such a large force. He ordered his men to scatter. As they obeyed, someone fired his musket. No one knows who fired that first shot. Suddenly, the British guns roared. 8 Americans were killed and 10 were wounded. The British pressed on to Concord. They found few guns and little gunpowder. A colonial force attacked the British soldiers and forced them to retreat. As the British marched back to Boston, they were fired upon from all sides. Minutemen took aim from behind stone walls and trees. By the time the exhausted British soldiers reached Boston, more than 250 of them had been killed or wounded. The Minutemen followed them. In the hills surrounding Boston, their campfires lit up the night sky. On June 17th, British General William Howe ordered more than 2,000 men to drive the Americans from Breed's Hill. On top of the hill, the Americans crouched behind a stone wall and an earthen fort. The British thought that the untrained Americans would flee, but when the British came near the wall, the Americans fired. At such short range, it was impossible to miss. The British soldiers streamed back down the hill. Soon enough, though, the brave British redcoats formed again and attacked. Another firestorm of American bullets shattered their lines. Howe ordered a third attack. As the British approached the earthen fort, only a few shots rang out. The Americans had run out of ammunition. Now the Americans retreated. The British had taken the hill, but they had also learned that the Americans would fight. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or injured in that battle. The Continental Congress met for a second time in May of 1775 to discuss the war. One of the leaders was a man named George Washington. John Adams, a delegate from Massachusetts, wrote that Washington had a soldier-like air. The next month, Washington was named commander of the American forces in the Continental Army. Washington understood the difficulty of winning the war. The powerful British Navy ruled the seas, and their army was well equipped and well trained. When Washington took control of the Continental Army, they had few weapons or uniforms. In March of 1776, the Americans began firing captured British cannon at the British soldiers still in Boston. The British troops boarded their ships and left the city. But Washington remained worried. Where would the British strike next? In June of 1776, a fleet of British ships brought 32,000 soldiers to the outskirts of New York City. Washington rushed his men to meet them. The British and Hessians, the Hessians were German soldiers hired by the British, attacked and drove the Americans out of the city. Defeated, Washington pulled his battered army into New Jersey. But good news came. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress approved a document called the Declaration of Independence. With the words, "All men are created equal," the American colonies declared themselves free from Britain. Still, unless the Americans defeated the British in battle, the Declaration was a useless piece of paper. By winter, Washington's men had been defeated on Long Island, New York. They had retreated through New Jersey to Pennsylvania. Snowstorms drenched the frozen and hungry soldiers. Meanwhile, in Trenton, New Jersey, 1,500 Hessian soldiers rested in snug, warm buildings. In this dark hour, Washington planned his boldest move. After nightfall, on Christmas Day in 1776, he loaded his soldiers into boats and crossed the Delaware River. See that picture of him in a boat with some soldiers crossing the river? The Continental Army landed in New Jersey and began marching on Trenton. In Trenton, the Hessian soldiers were sound asleep when cannon fire shook them from their beds. Out of the morning mist, American soldiers appeared, surprising the unprepared Hessians. Almost 1,000 of them surrendered. Howe heard of the disaster and rushed British troops to Trenton, but Washington slipped around him and attacked at Princeton. The British retreated again. News spread of the two victories. After a year of defeats, the Americans started to hope. I think Grandma will pause right here and we'll read some more of this story in another one so that it's not such a long time to watch. But remember, this is the story of the starting of our country, the United States of America, and the brave men who fought and the general who led us. And it's a very cool, neat story that we should know about. Remember, Grandma loves you, and we'll share some more next time.